street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall never go.
All right, so I want to start off with 1 John chapter 4. First John chapter 4, verses 20 and 21. We've talked a lot over the last month or so that we've been dealing with the law and these commandments about the foundation that the two great commandments that Jesus taught about, loving God and loving our fellow man, has. Before we get into this section about these commandments that were primarily to teach and reinforce their love for others, I want to talk about why it's so important. We looked at 8 specific laws that we could say, but this is definitely geared toward the love of God. We're going to look at 30 of the laws that are recorded that you can see a connection between love of man. And the question becomes why? Why is it so important that we understand and love our fellow man? Well, John speaks about it in 1 John 4, 20 and 21. If anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. That's strong language. It's extremely strong language, because what the Bible says about liars is that all liars will have their place in hell. So to use language like that is extremely, extremely strong. If I say I love God and yet hate men, I'm a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother. It is mandatory, required, that if we do love God, that we must also love our brother. That is why it is so important for him to reinforce and give laws that reinforce the love of neighbor. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. If I don't get that right, then I don't get the great law right either. The great commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. I don't get that if I don't get the second one. That's what John is saying here. And so it's extremely important that we understand these things and that we relate to the fact that it's not optional for us to love our fellow men. It's not okay when it's convenient. When is it convenient to love men? Okay, well, let's start on the easiest plane first. Before, when they love us back, there's something that comes even before that. It's really, really easy to love someone who first loves you. So it's easy for us to love our parents. It's easy for us to love our grandparents. They've been showering love upon us from the moment we appeared in the world. So it's pretty easy for us to love them. Now, we do go through days that we don't, which just goes to underscore how hard it is. Yeah, when we're teenagers, there are days we don't love our parents. How hard it is to always love your fellow man. It's very difficult. So, at the root of most of the commandments of God is the reinforcement and the drive to actually love your fellow man. Because it's hard for us to do. And we know that the law exists because of sin. Sin happens because of a lack of love. That's what is it? James says that love covers a multitude of sins. What he's saying by that is not that if you love somebody, you overlook their sin. It's not saying that at all. It's saying that if you love, you don't commit sin. We still, because we don't love, we hate because we don't love. We're jealous because we don't love. We're envious because we don't love. We commit adultery because we don't love. If we loved as we ought, we wouldn't do any of those things. You don't harm the object of your love if you do it right. And so it's extremely important, but it's extremely hard because not everybody in the world loves us first. Some people are we'll go with aloof, and they build a shell around themselves because they don't trust others. And it's really hard to engage with them. And it takes a long time for you to get through that separation that they create so that a relationship can exist. It's much harder to love those people. You have to work at it. You have to think about it. You have to come up with ways to do it, and then you have to be persistent. But then what about those who don't love you at all, who in fact hate you and do despite to you? How hard is it to love those people? And yet that's exactly what we're called to do, to love even our enemies. So if the law is given because of sin and to bring transgressors back to God, which is the argument that the Bible makes, then much of the law has to be written to address the sins that are the most common to us and that are the biggest problems for us. And it's interesting to me the way that 1 John 4 is written. It recognizes the very common circumstance where people believe that they love God, but they don't love their fellow men. That's actually a common place for people to find themselves. If you talk to them, oh yeah, I love God. But then they speak evil about people. And they lack affection that they should have. And so it's a real problem. And so a lot of what God is doing is training us to overcome that problem. So let's talk about some of those things. Going back to chapter 21, in the early laws that we looked at, verses 2 through 4, there are some laws about Hebrew slaves and that are served for 6 years and then to go free in the 7th year. Is that how 18th and 19th century slavery was practiced in the world? Now, there's also a difference in that word and how it was used and what it constituted, but for our purposes, that's not important. The idea of having someone who was a servant unto you, that worked for you, and that served you, and that you had control and mastery over, that's why the slave is said to have a master, is primarily to help whom? At least in our conception of it, well, it's primarily to help the master. And the master doesn't want his slaves to be gone in the 7th year. He wants the slaves to do what? Stay and work a long time. By the way, there's a provision for that in the law. If the slave loves the master and desires to stay, that expression can be made, a covenant can be entered into that involved driving an awl through the man's ear, which is kind of strange, but there was a way in which that love could be codified and he could stay for the remainder of his life. in that service. But 6 years and then go free the 7th year. And there is, I believe, an inherent connection between all the other 6 and 7 relationships. In 6 days he created the world, the 7th day he rested, the 7th day Sabbath, the same thing here. You work for 6 years, the 7th year you go free. This is something connected to compassion and fairness in dealing with servants. What Jesus would teach regarding these kind of relationships when Jesus was on the earth and teaching people was, as you would have others do to you, so you do to them. So if you're the master in the relationship, if you have the power, what you do to the ones who are under your control is treat them the way that you would wish to be treated if you were the one who was subjugated. And that is underscored by this law, that concept of compassion and fairness and release. The next 2 verses, verses 5 and 6, a slave can choose to serve for the life of his master. Well, we talked about that already. That's respecting the free will of others in relationship. Who got to make that decision? Was it the master who said, look, I really, really like you a lot. I want you to stay with me. Come over here and let me drive this all through your ear. Is that who got to make the choice? And the answer is no. It's the slave who gets to make the choice. And therefore the master has to do what? Respect the free will of the slave. Is that how slavery was practiced in, what was that now? Close to 300 years ago? Up through about 175 years ago. So for about 150 years on North America, we practiced a slavery that didn't view that they had any free will. In fact, most people viewed them as chattel, as property that they possessed, no different than their silverware. Verses 7 through 11, some special rules for female slaves and for their protection if they are married by their master. Protecting the rights and the dignity of women in servitude. That's clearly an instructional thing about showing love to people in a very vulnerable position. Teaching them how to respect other individuals who are in a very vulnerable, exposed position relative to them. You get into chapter 12 and verse 12 and after that in chapter 21. You're dealing with laws regarding violence. We looked at the punishment of murder and protection for accidental killing. That's all about respecting life and justice, right? Death penalty for striking a parent. What's that about? Honoring your parents. Having respect for individuals who have charge over you. If you grow up and respect your parents, what are you also more likely to do? Respect others, respect authority figures, and respect God. If you learn how to respect your parents, then it's easier to respect the civil authorities. It's easier to respect God. It's easier to respect those like your boss who has some authority over you because you've learned how to do that. Death penalty for kidnapping. Listen, that simply teaches to respect the freedom of other people. If I go take someone against their will, God says your life is to be forfeited for such. Which, by the way, largely was at the root of the way slavery was practiced in the antebellum, period. Now, it wasn't all mean Americans going over and kidnapping people. Sometimes it was their own fellow countrymen who did it. But it all started the same way, with someone being taken against their will and sold into bondage. Something that we read about in Genesis with Joseph. That kind of behavior is very disrespectful to the life of the individual and to the freedom that God has afforded that individual. Learn to respect that. That is learning to show love and piety toward others. Let's see. Verse 17, if you cursed your parents. Again, this is the same connection with having honor and respect for your parents and recognizing the way that is shown through your behavior, even your speech. If I learn not to speak evil of my parents or speak evil to my parents, then it's easier for me also to be respectful what? To other folks. Listen, public school teachers can tell very quickly which children are raised in homes where they're taught to respect their parents and the ones that are not taught that. I suspect police officers pick up on that. Even college teachers pick up on that. You learn real quick. If they show respect to me, they're clearly being taught to show respect in the home, because they don't really have any reason to respect me other than the fact that they understand, wait a minute, you know what? This person is older than me, and this person's been given a position of authority over me for this time. I will show them respect. By the way, if you cursed your parents, what was the penalty? Death. Again, to bring into sharp contrast how important it is to love those around us and to manifest that love and respect.
Deuteronomy 21:18-21 indicates that so capital punishment for rebellion against any of them.
Right. And all that, again, goes back to, if I love my neighbor, then it's possible for me to love God. But if I don't love my neighbor, then I can't love God. Verses 18 and 19, compensation for injuries caused in a fight. Well, that's all about taking responsibility for the harm that you do to others. That's a measure of respect as well. You understand that you now have a debt to them because you've injured them. Punishment for beating a slave to death is covered. That's protection of life extended even to slaves. Every society generally accepts that equals deserve the protection of life, but people that they don't view as equals, well, that's another story. God said no. Everyone deserves a protection of life, other than those who fail to respect life. And that goes all the way back to when? When was that principle set forth by God? Anybody remember? Goes all the way back to Genesis 9, right after the flood's over with. There's a covenant that's made with Noah that involves, I will not destroy the earth by water again, that involves giving the animal to man for food the way that the green plant had been given to man for food, and then says, and man shall not kill man. Now, he's just said you can kill animals. Kill them and eat them. And then he says, but you shall not kill your fellow man. Murder. We're going to use that word, draw that distinction, because some people don't understand that the very next breath he says, anyone who does that, anyone who just wantonly slays, has no respect for the life of the people around them and takes their life, by man shall his blood be shed. And so there is sanctioned life-taking, And that sanctioned life taking is based upon what? The lack of respect for life in others. Genesis 9 lays that principle down. He's carrying it out in the law here. It's the same basis on which these things are capital offenses. Punishment for causing pregnant woman to miscarry, 22 through 25. Respecting life, respecting bodily integrity. A slave must be freed if they're injured by their master. Again, fairness and justice for those who are under authority. Punishment for death that is caused by your ox. If my ox kills someone, there's punishment that's involved in that. If I know that my ox is likely to kill someone, there's even greater punishment that's levied against me, because that's even worse. In the one case, it happens unintended. I'm just being negligent. In the other case, I don't care. And so there's a greater punishment leveled against that latter thing, which is considered worse, to just disregard the value of the people around you. Responsibility for controlling your dangerous property, laws about injury caused by an uncovered pit or a violent animal. Again, just having the respect for others so that you care for their safety, so that you don't create hazardous circumstances and let them get harmed or killed because you don't care. We might see manifestations of that kind of attitude in our society with someone in the city, let's say, who goes into their backyard with a long gun or a high-powered handgun and starts target shooting in their backyard. What's the problem with that? Because bullets don't stop. Just because they don't get to your property line, go, oh, okay, I'm going to fall down here because this is the end of the property. I can't go any further. They go into your neighbor's yard and through your neighbor's house. And more than once, small children have been killed sitting in their parents' living room or laying in their cribs in their bedroom because of a firearm that went off in a neighbor's house. And that is just disregard for the life of the people around you. And even our laws say that's not okay. Restitution for theft starts in chapter 22. The respect for others extends beyond their life and well-being. It also has to respect what? Their property. How much respect do I need to have for others? What's it mean to love my neighbor as myself? Well, it means that I love them enough not to take something that belongs to them. Restitution for damage caused by grazing livestock. What might we equate to that? We don't have a whole lot of grazing livestock in the city of Lafayette, so my neighbor's cows are not going to cross over my fence and start eating my grass. So what might we equate to that? Okay, potentially loose dogs or pets. What about my cat that may get up in the middle of somebody's car and scratch up the hood and do destruction to their property because I'm not paying attention? Or what about driving through their yard and putting ruts in their yard? Doing damage to their property just because I don't care. It's not mine. Responsibility for damage caused to personal property is followed by restitution for fire damage. And then he talks about restitution for property given in trust that's stolen. Restitution for lost or damaged property in someone's care. Someone loans me something. What should I do? Take care of it. In many cases, what I try to do I really do. Is if someone loans me something, I try to give it back, not in the same condition it was in when I got it, but in better condition it was in than I got it, if I can. Some things you can't do that with. Can't really make a book in better condition than you got it in. But what I do sometimes with tools and things like that I borrow is I clean them up and I perform the maintenance on them that should be performed, and I give it back to them clean and maintained and ready for them to use the next time. That is, by the way, not a brilliant thing that I came up with, and I'm just such a nice guy and I'm thoughtful of it. It's from reading the Bible and going, you know what? That's just what we ought to do. That's how you show respect to people. By the way, have you ever loaned someone something and either not gotten it back or gotten it back in a condition that it didn't work anymore? Is that respectful to you? Is that honoring you in any way? And the answer is no. In fact, it's very disrespectful. All of these laws are teaching so that in any circumstance that you find yourself in life, if you've been trained in all of these ways, in any circumstance you find yourself in life, you ought to be thinking, okay, wait a minute, you know what? I think what God wants me to do is be respectful and to respect their life and their property and their freedom and their choices and not try to impose. And so when we get to the New Testament, within the Lord's church, there is a role to be played called an overseer. And yet they're told specifically not to do what? Not to lord over the church, not to try to abuse that authority. It's the same thing. It's the exact same principle that many of these laws are trying to teach. You go on through chapter 22. If a man seduces a virgin, he has to marry her or pay a dowry for her. Responsibility for personal actions and caring for the dignity of others. I shouldn't engage in the fornication. But if I engage in the fornication, then I at least should do what? Make it right to the best of my ability. Show piety toward the person to the best that I can. So at the least, and the dowry part, if you'll remember the way that law worked, if the man who did this thing was willing to actually take the bride, but the father said no, you still were obligated to pay the bride price, the dowry, for the financial loss, which actually extends this to another level, because it says not only should I show piety and respect for the woman, but also for her family. Don't mistreat foreigners, widows, and orphans. Again, who are the foreigners, widows, and orphans? Well, they're the most vulnerable people among you. These are the people who have the least bit of ability to care for, to protect, and to defend themselves. So it becomes incumbent upon me, if I love others, to defend the defenseless. Unfortunately, for far too many people, they're happy to prey upon the defenseless, which again simply is someone who hasn't learned to love my neighbor as myself. And if I don't love my neighbor as myself, then I can't love God. You do realize that probably, well, I don't know what the percentages would be, but I'm just going to grab this number out of the air. Probably 90% of slave owners professed that they loved God. But did they really? Prohibitions against charging interest and taking necessary items as collateral. This was such a strict thing, it went on down to the point that if you took someone's cloak and held it as a token of good faith in a thing. You know, I need this, kind of, okay, but give me your cloak so I can be sure you'll come back for it. They said, God said, you have to be sure you return it before the sun goes down. And what was his reasoning? Yeah, he uses that for his covering when he goes to bed. You don't leave somebody out there without protection from the weather. That's just not nice. Be holy, do not eat flesh torn by beasts. Respecting community standards and the purity and holiness of the community. There's a whole section after the children of Israel go into the promised land and begin to fight about sin coming into the camp. And when sin came into the camp, what happened to the whole? Well, they began to have problems and trouble and be unsuccessful. And so they had to find and identify that problem. That one individual's actions affected the people around them. He's teaching us about that, because that also is a part of loving my neighbor as myself, of actually being thoughtful about my behavior and how it's going to affect the people around me. And then trying, therefore, to act in the way that's not just in my best interest, but is in the interest of everyone's good. Chapter 23, do not spread false reports. Clearly, that's about truthfulness in relationships. Well, why is that important? Do we have to actually list it? Do we have to talk about how disrespectful it is to deceive someone or to lie to someone or to put them in a position that... I just saw a video this afternoon of a guy who was preaching on a college campus, and another person, presumably a Christian, young lady, very earnest, she was almost moved to tears as she was talking, basically saying you shouldn't be doing that. If we'll just let our lives be testimony, people will come to Jesus. We shouldn't be telling people these things. He said, let me ask you a question. Do you think that if you die in your sins separate from Christ, that you'll go to hell? Yes. So you believe that these people, if they die in their sins without knowing Christ and without serving Christ, they're going to hell? Yes. How can you not tell them these things if you love them? That's a valid question. Because how do you withhold information that people need and leave them in a position where they're harmed? Do not follow a crowd to do evil or show partiality in court. Verses 2 and 3, justice, integrity in legal matters. You ever heard anybody say, well, it's just business? You ever heard that? You know what they mean by that, right? I wouldn't do that in a personal interaction, but this is business, and business is cutthroat. And you know what God's saying? There is no difference. You seek for truth and justice in every relationship in this life. Even if other people are doing the wrong thing, you don't do it. You don't join in. By the way, that's another thing that's really, really hard. The bandwagon effect is a real thing.
It's called the social proof. In other words, people think a lot of people engaging in a behavior of some sort means it's correct. So that's when people get on the bandwagon.
Right.
Engage in or mob action. They think their ethics or their standards are all correct just by the number. But Christianity is, in some sense, just the opposite. You don't do what the majority says. You do what not.
Right. McDonald's, I guess they still say this on the bottom of their signs. They may have changed it, but they used to post on the bottom of all their signs how many hamburgers they'd sold. I think they were up to something like 100 billion the last time I saw one. And what's the point of that? 100 billion people can't be wrong. You're just going to be like your neighbor if you come do this. The question is, when it comes to something like this, when the people around you are doing the wrong thing, what do you do? And you refrain.
When they advertise a lot of products and it's popular brand.
Don't pervert justice. Don't take bribes. Don't oppress the poor. Don't oppress foreigners. He keeps extending this out. Then he says, verses 10 through 19, even the land should rest every year. This is care for the community and care for the poor. During that rest every seventh year, whatever grew up voluntarily in your field was free pickings to the community. You were not allowed to harvest it. It belonged to the others. That was teaching them to have a sense of community and provision for those who were less fortunate than them. Keep the Sabbath day for rest, ensuring rest for yourself, for your servants, even for your animals. He extended it all the way down to animals on that one, so that we would listen. If you need to let your animal rest, if you understand that there's a time you got to let that is just not humane to overwork your animal, then you ought to very easily be able to understand that it's only proper for you to allow people to rest. And so all of those things are teaching and underscoring the importance of loving your neighbor as yourself. My light says I'm not having to stop, but the clock says I have to stop, so I'm going to. Anybody have any questions or comments? All right, next time, if the Lord wills, we will move on and we will deal with, chapter 24 and the covenant being ratified. Thanks for your participation today.
I have heard